In the bone-dry summer of 1975, a young woman named Mae Hollis, then just 26 years old, found herself the sole steward of a legacy written in dust and timothy grass. The Hollis farm wasn't the biggest in that part of Oregon, not by a long shot, but it had an honest heart, etched into the land by 3 generations of calloused hands. Her father had passed a year prior, leaving her with a massey Ferguson tractor that wept oil, 200 acres of hayfield, and a piece of advice that was as much a compass as it was a curse. The land keeps score, Mae. So do the people. That summer, the sky forgot how to cry. A dome of high pressure, relentless and brassy, settled over the Pacific Northwest and refused to move. It baked the moisture from the soil until the ground cracked into a mosaic of thirst. Creeks shrank into muddy veins, and the great rolling hills of the Willamette Valley, usually a tapestry of greens, faded to the color of old parchment. It was a drought that whispered of ruin, and for the cattlemen and ranchers, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. Their pastures were gone, turned to brittle straw under the hooves of hungry livestock. Their own hay reserves dwindled, then vanished. Panic began to set in, a quiet, desperate fever that traveled from one barren farm to the next. Now, Mae Hollis had been lucky, or maybe just wise. Her father had taught her to read the land not just for the season she was in, but for the season that was coming. He had shown her how the pines on the high ridge held their needles, how the ants built their hills, small signs that foretold a long, dry spell. Acting on that inherited instinct, she had cut her first crop of alfalfa a week earlier than anyone else, baling it under the last of the spring moisture. Her second cut was thin, but it was there. When the drought truly took hold, Mae's barn was full. It was a fortress of fragrant, green-gold bales stacked to the rafters, a treasure in a starving land. And let me tell you, the world knows when a person has something that everyone else needs. The phone in her small farmhouse began to ring. The first calls were tentative, neighbors she knew. Then came the calls from farther out, voices of men she'd never met, their words heavy with the weight of their herds. The market, as it always does in times of scarcity, had turned cruel. Hay prices quadrupled overnight. Farmers who had surplus, men who ran operations 5 times the size of hers, were hoarding their stock. They were waiting, letting the desperation build, knowing that a rancher would trade his grandfather's watch for a dozen bales to get his cattle through another week. It was called good business. It was called supply and demand. The local co-op, the hub of all agricultural commerce in the county, was run by a man named Mr. Abernathy. He was a man whose softness was a statement. His hands were clean, his boots were polished, and he saw the world through the clean, sharp lens of a balance sheet. He called Mae personally. His voice was slick with opportunity. "Mae," he'd said, the sound crackling over the line, "you're sitting on a gold mine. We're getting offers of $200 a ton, and I think it'll hit $300 by next month. Just tell me how much you have. We'll handle the logistics. You won't have to lift a finger." There was a pause, and Mae could almost hear the man smiling, picturing the commissions. Mae stood in her kitchen, the phone cord coiled around her fist, and looked out the window at her fields, shimmering under the oppressive sun. She saw her father's face in her mind, his brow furrowed in concentration as he taught her to listen to the engine of the baler, to know its heart by its rhythm. He never spoke of gold mines. He spoke of stewardship. He spoke of neighbors. "I'm not selling through the co-op, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The line was silent for a moment. "What's that? Did I hear you right, girl? This is a once-in-a-decade opportunity." "I'll be selling direct," she replied, leaving no room for argument. "You can give my number to anyone who calls you looking. But you tell them my price." "And what price is that?" Abernathy asked, a note of condescending curiosity in his tone. Mae did the math in her head. The cost of fuel, the twine, the maintenance on the old baler, a sliver for her own time. The price that would allow her to do it all again next year, and nothing more. $50 a ton, she said. The silence on the other end of the line was no longer speculative. It was heavy with disbelief, with something bordering on offense. Mr. Abernathy believed he was being made a fool of. 50? Mae, that's cost. That's less than cost. You're leaving $1,000 on the table. It's foolish. It's my price, she said, and then she gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. She did not slam it. Her father had taught her that anger was a luxury, a waste of energy better spent on fixing a fence. She simply ended the conversation. The decision was made. It had been made a year ago, standing beside her father's grave when she promised to honor the name he had built. The next day, she drove her flatbed truck into town for supplies. She had to pass the co-op, and as she did, she saw Mr. Abernathy standing on the loading dock with a handful of the county's most established farmers. These were men with weathered faces and sprawling ranches, men who had known her father, but who saw her only as a girl playing at a man's game. Abernathy pointed a thumb toward her truck as it rumbled past. He was telling them. She could see it in the way his mouth moved, in the way they all turned to look, their faces a mixture of pity and ridicule. One of them shook his head slowly, a gesture that said more than words ever could. The poor, foolish girl. Hollis must be spinning in his grave. Mae kept her eyes forward, her hands steady on the wheel. Their judgment was like the wind against the barn. It made a lot of noise, but it couldn't move the foundation. Her first customer was a man from over in Polk County. He arrived in a battered Ford pickup, the tires worn nearly bald, his face etched with worry. He had 3 young children and a herd of 50 dairy cows that were his entire world. He'd been to 3 other farms that morning and had been quoted prices that would have meant selling off half his herd. He walked with Mae to the barn, and when his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw the mountains of hay. His shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, straightened just a little. "Heard a rumor about your price," he said, his voice raspy with dust and doubt. "Figured it had to be a mistake." "50 a ton," Mae confirmed, pulling a bale hook from a post. "How much can you haul?" The man stared at her, then at the hay, as if trying to solve a complex equation that didn't make sense. He looked at her hands, already calloused and capable. He wasn't looking at a girl anymore. He was looking at a lifeline. He swallowed hard. "I can take 2 tons. Mae worked alongside him, swinging the heavy bales onto his truck with a practiced rhythm. The air was thick with the sweet, dry smell of cured alfalfa. They didn't talk much. There was no need. In the quiet space between them, a transaction was occurring that had nothing to do with the $100 he would eventually press into her hand. It was a covenant of survival. When the truck was loaded, he stood by the door, twisting his hat in his hands. I don't know what to say, Miss Hollis. You've saved us. Just get your herd fed," Mae said simply. "That's all that matters." He nodded, his eyes shining with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. He drove away, and Mae watched the dust from his truck hang in the still air until it settled back onto the earth. She didn't feel like a fool. She felt like a farmer. Word traveled, not in the newspaper or on the radio, but the way real news travels in the country, over barbed wire fences, at lonely crossroads, and in hushed tones at the feed store. The stream of trucks to the Hollis farm became a steady flow. They came from all over. Men from Washington, their rigs caked with the red dirt of their home state. Ranchers from the high desert of eastern Oregon, their faces burned by a different kind of sun. Each one arrived with the same weary skepticism, and each one left with a truckload of hope and the same stunned look of gratitude. Mae worked from sunup to sundown, her muscles aching, her skin coated in a fine layer of dust and sweat. She kept a simple ledger, a spiral notebook where she wrote the date, the name, and the amount. She never wrote the price. The price was a constant. It was the anchor in the storm. Her barn began to empty. The great, solid walls of hay receded, leaving open spaces that seemed vast and vulnerable. By late August, when the drought was at its most vicious, her surplus was gone. Every last bale she could spare had been sold. The men who had laughed on the co-op dock had made their fortunes. They had new pickups and their wives had new dresses. Mr. Abernathy boasted of record profits. Mae had just enough money to pay her property taxes and buy seed for the next year. Her barn was a hollow cavern, echoing with the memory of abundance. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Not for profit, but for a principle? It is a lonely, frightening thing to stand on a conviction when the entire world is telling you that you are wrong. In the quiet of that empty barn, in the dead of a hot, silent night, Mae Hollis felt the cold grip of doubt. She saw the new equipment on her neighbors' farms. She heard the whispers in town that she had squandered her inheritance, that she had given away her father's hard work for a pittance. She sat on an overturned bucket, the scent of hay still clinging to the old wood, and she wondered if they were right. Had her father's philosophy been the naive rambling of an old man out of touch with the modern world? Was she a fool? Was she a failure? She closed her eyes and saw the face of that first rancher from Polk County, the raw relief in his eyes. She saw the dozens of other faces that followed, men who had looked at her not with pity, but with a deep, abiding respect. They hadn't just bought hay from her. They had received a gift of dignity. They had been treated not as a mark, but as a fellow traveler in a hard land. And in that moment, the doubt receded. She knew she had not sold her hay. She had invested it. She had planted it in the good soil of other people's lives. And she would have to trust in the harvest, however long it took. The subsequent decade was a master class in patience. The rains returned the following year, and the land recovered. Mae's farm continued. It did not expand, it did not modernize at the pace of the others, but it endured. She remained a solitary figure, a woman defined by the legend of her one foolish summer. The story of 1,975 became a piece of local folklore. For men like Abernathy, it was a cautionary tale about a soft-hearted girl who didn't understand business. For the ranchers and their families, it was something else entirely, a story told in quieter tones, a benchmark of decency against which other people were measured. Mae herself never spoke of it. She simply worked. She rose before the sun, mended her fences, coaxed life from the soil, and lived by the rhythm of the seasons. She was neither rich nor poor. She was solvent. She was independent. And she was alone, content in the world she had maintained through sheer force of will and her father's quiet wisdom. She was a fixture, as constant as the mountain on the horizon. The world changed around her, but Mae Hollis and her farm remained. Then, in 1985, 10 years after the first great thirst, the sky closed up again. This drought was different. It came on faster, meaner. A hot wind blew out of the east for weeks, a hellish breath that seared the fields before they even had a chance to grow. Mae's first cut of hay was a fraction of what it should have been. Her second cut never came at all. The earth, which she had so carefully nurtured, turned to concrete beneath her boots. This time, the wolf was not at her neighbor's doors. It was at hers. Her own small herd of cattle grew thin, their lowing a constant, mournful complaint. The fortress that had saved so many a decade ago was now empty. Her savings were meager, a thin blanket against a coming blizzard of debt. For the first time in her life, Mae Hollis was the one in need. The market, predictably, went insane. Hay prices soared past the records set in '75. The men who had called her a fool then were now titans of the industry, their barns overflowing, their prices astronomical. Mae would not be able to afford to buy from them, even if she could swallow her pride. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they would take a particular satisfaction in turning her away. She called no one. She asked for nothing. If the farm was to fail, it would fail quietly, with the same dignity with which it had been run. One morning in early September, she woke before dawn, a habit ingrained in her bones. The air was cool, but held no promise of rain. She went to the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee, her mind already cataloging the impossible tasks of the day. And then she saw them. Headlights. Not one pair, but two, then four, then a dozen, turning off the main road and onto her long gravel driveway. They were trucks. Big trucks. Semis, flatbeds, pickups with gooseneck trailers. They crept up her drive slowly, their engines a low, respectful rumble in the pre-dawn stillness. They weren't stopping at the gate. They were coming for the house. A knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Was it the bank? Had she missed a payment? Was this how it ended, with a fleet of repo men coming to dismantle her life before the sun was even up? She stood at her kitchen window, her heart pounding, as the convoy came to a stop, forming a line that stretched from her barn all the way back to the county road. Doors opened, and men began to get out. They were silhouettes in the growing light, shapes of farmers and ranchers, broad-shouldered and quiet. Mae pulled on her boots and a jacket and walked out onto the porch, her mind racing. The lead truck, a big Peterbilt, hissed as its air brakes engaged. The driver, a man about her age with kind eyes and a familiar face she couldn't quite place, swung down from the cab. He took off his hat as he approached her. "Miss Hollis?" he asked, though he already knew. "I'm Mae Hollis," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "My name is Ben Carter," he said. "My father was John Carter, from Polk County. You might not remember him." Mae's breath caught in her throat. "The man with the bald tires. The first truck. I remember him," she whispered. Ben Carter nodded, a small smile touching his lips. He gestured with his hat back at the impossibly long line of trucks. "We heard you might be in a tight spot. This drought's a mean one." He looked over at her barren fields, then back at her. "My dad, he never stopped talking about 1,975. He told me, that woman didn't just sell us hay, son. She gave us a future. He made me promise that if you ever needed a hand, we'd be the first in line." Mae looked past him, at the men gathering in her yard. There were dozens of them. Old men with faces like road maps, and young men who would have been children a decade ago. She didn't recognize most of them. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. Who are all these men?" "Well," Ben said, putting his hat back on, "my dad told his neighbor. And that neighbor told his brother-in-law over in Klamath County. And I guess he told a few people. For 10 years, ma'am, the story's been passed around. It seems a lot of folks felt they owed you a debt." He paused and looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to crest. "My dad always said you kept a different kind of ledger, Miss Hollis. Turns out, so did everyone else." And then, without another word, the men turned to their trucks. They unstrapped their loads. They were filled with hay. Beautiful, green, fragrant hay. Bales began to move from the trucks to her empty barn. It was a silent, efficient army, working with a shared and unspoken purpose. A man from Washington State whom Mae had never laid eyes on stopped as he carried a bale past her. "The fella I bought my herd from, he told me he wouldn't have had a herd to sell if it weren't for you." Said to pay it forward if I ever got the chance. He just nodded and kept walking. Another, a wiry old rancher from Idaho, tipped his hat. Never met you, ma'am, but I know a man who knows a man who does. That was enough for me. 40 trucks, 40 loads of hay. They filled her barn to bursting. They stacked the rest in neat, towering ricks beside it, covering them with tarps against a rain that wasn't coming, but as a gesture of care. It took them 3 hours. When they were done, the sun was fully up, illuminating a scene of impossible abundance. Mae stood on her porch, speechless, tears streaming down her face for the first time in 10 years. She had sown a few seeds of kindness into a parched earth, and a forest had grown in return. The men gathered their things, ready to leave as quietly as they had come. They asked for nothing. Not a penny. Ben Carter came back to the porch. This should get you through the winter and then some, he said. Ben, Mae said, finding her voice. How did you all coordinate this? He shrugged. Wasn't hard. The first whisper started a month ago that you were hit bad. 1 phone call became 10. 10 became 100. People were calling me, asking if they could help. People you never even met. It was the easiest thing in the world, Miss Hollis. All we had to do was remember. As the trucks began to rumble back down the driveway, one last vehicle pulled in. It was a shiny new sedan, out of place among the dusty rigs. Mr. Abernathy got out. He was older now, heavier, but he wore the same look of calculated authority. He looked at the mountains of hay, at the last of the departing trucks, and then at Mae. He walked over to her, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. He looked humbled. He looked, for the first time, like a man who had made a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of the world. Mae, he said, his voice stripped of its old arrogance. I saw the commotion from the road. I had to see. He shook his head in disbelief. All these years I told that story. The story of the girl who gave away a fortune. I was wrong. You didn't give it away. He looked at the hay, a tangible monument to her father's philosophy. You invested it. He stood there for a long moment, the co-op manager, the man of numbers and ledgers, finally understanding an economy he had never been able to quantify. He finally just nodded, turned, and left. It was not an apology in words, but it was an admission. It was an acknowledgement. Let me tell you what that hay represented. It was more than just winter feed for a handful of cattle. It was proof. It was the harvest of a crop planted 10 years before. It was the physical manifestation of a community's long memory. Mae Hollis had learned the lesson her father had tried to teach her, a lesson that the Mr. Abernathys of the world will never comprehend. Wealth is not what you keep. It's what you give away. And debt is not just something recorded in a bank's ledger. The most important debts are recorded in the hearts of good people, and they are always, always repaid with interest. The men at the co-op said her business was foolish. She didn't run a business. She built a community, and the community remembered.